Now that we have our card and card list components, the next thing that we want to add in is our search feature. So if we go into our final application, when we look at the search feature, what we see is a text box that takes a user's typed inputs and filters out the cards based on what they type in. So if I type in LE, it will filter out any monster whose name does not have LE in it. Now, how do we build this? Well, let's first go back to our application code. And what we first need is the HTML element that will represent the text input. And what we're going to use is an input HTML element. Now, these input HTML elements are pretty much just basic text inputs. If we put type on it, which is a HTML property that all inputs have, we can give it a different string, and that string will help us get some features in the input that we might want for different types of inputs. For example, if we use password, whatever we type will become hidden. And the one we actually want will be search. And what search gives us is the ability to put on this placeholder, which will essentially put a string there when we haven't typed anything into the search field. So now we'll say search monsters, and that is the placeholder, right? But once we type, we see that it gets hidden. And then we can clear it away with that little X button. So type search allows us to use that placeholder, but now what we need to do is we actually need to be able to hijack or take control whenever the user types something into the input, because we want to store that string on our state. And by storing it on our state, we're able to use it in order to actually filter out our monsters. So let's first figure out how to store that on our state. Well, the first thing we would do is actually add a field to our state that would represent what that stored value will be. So we'll call it search field, and we'll make it start as an empty string. Next, what we'll do is we actually have access to this method on our input called onChange. And what onChange does is it fires with this synthetic event, which is essentially just an event in our browser, right? Whenever the input is changed. So whenever the user types or removes anything. But let's just take a look at what that looks like. And what we pass to onChange is actually this function where E represents the synthetic event we're talking about, right? And for now, let's just console log E, and we'll see what happens. Let's go to our browser and open up our terminal using right click and clicking inspect, and then hitting the console. Now, whenever we type anything into our input, we will see our onChange fire, which was that function that we wrote that logs that synthetic event. We also see that it changes whenever we remove any of the characters. And this is because it's literally as the method says. Whenever the value in that input changes, fire my onChange event. Fire the onChange with whatever function we pass to it. And what we'll see on our synthetic event is that it's this huge object with all these things on it. And this is because it's a native event that the browser uses to do all kinds of different things, right? It gives us a lot of control, but we actually don't need to worry about more than like 99% of the stuff on here. The main thing that we do want to look at is this target value. There's a get and there's a set, but that mainly means that we can either get the value of what target is or set the value, but we don't want to set the value. We just want to get the actual target value. And what it will give us back is the HTML element. And we can see if we log it. So when I say that it gives us the HTML element, it's because it's the HTML element that fired the event. So if we now log it, we see that that's our input. And we can actually hover over it and it'll tell us where on the page that element is. And there's our search element, right? So what we want off of this is actually the value. And value is a property on the input that will give us literally the string value that it holds, right? And see, as we type it, we're getting that string value. And that's how we're going to be able to store that on our state. Now, how do we store this? We can do this by calling setState here the same way that we did when we got our users when inside of our component didMount method. So what we can do is call this .setState, and we can pass it that we want our search field value to be the e.target.value. Now, if we wanted to see this actually persist, right? If we wanted to make sure that our state was being updated, normally what we would think to do is just console log after we call this .setState. So we would think that if we called console log this .state, that we would see our state update. Now, let's actually test this out. We see that as we type, it looks like our event is firing, but our search field key is always one letter behind, which means that the first time we typed D, search field was actually not updated, right? Why is this? Well, this is actually because setState is an asynchronous function call. So asynchronous versus synchronous is a big thing in JavaScript development, especially in React. Synchronous action is something that we can expect to happen almost immediately. It's something that pretty much happens and JavaScript knows the amount of time it'll take. So JavaScript will wait for that thing to finish before it continues, right? Running the rest of the code afterwards. An asynchronous action or event is something that actually takes an indefinite amount of time that JavaScript does not know. So what it does is it actually runs the rest of the code after, and then when the asynchronous event finishes, it then runs that finished event. Now, I know this sounds confusing right now, but I promise that we'll cover it later when it makes more sense to do so. Right now, the main thing I want you to focus on is just that this setState is actually not happening immediately when we would expect it to, which means that yes, our state will be updated with this value that we've set here, but it's not going to happen in the immediate sense that we would expect it to. Instead, what we would do in order to log our state, there's actually a solution that React has given us. And it's going to be the second argument that we pass to setState. Now, it's going to be a callback, which runs after setState is finished. So after setState has updated our state, it will run the function that we pass. And here we can log this .state. And here we'll see that when we type now, we do see our latest value. So that's a thing to remember with setState. If we wanted to see or do something with our state right after we set it, then we have to do it inside of this second argument function that will get called right after setState. Okay, now that we have our search field being stored, let's actually filter out our monsters. But let's return our code back and get rid of this part that we don't need. So let's remove that. And then we don't need these brackets either, because all we want to do is just call our setState value.